Welcome, everyone. I think we're just waiting for the last few people to come in from the waiting room, and then we'll get started. Okay. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for either coming really early in the day or really late in the day to this really important event. Um, my name is Amanda Katapang. I am a Filipino people's lawyer based in New York City. I am a member of a new organization called People's Lawyers for Philippine Liberation, or PL for PL. I personally specialize in immigration, labor employment, national security law, um, especially with a focus on anti-trafficking work of migrant workers here in the Northeast region. Um, PL for PL is a recent baby organization here in New York um, people's lawyers and other legal advocates in solidarity for democracy and liberation in the Philippines. And our mission really is through our relationships with the National Democratic Movement. Not just here in the Northeast, but back in the Philippines as lawyers and seeing our part as lawyers, not just in support of struggle, but actually part of the struggle itself. We have been doing solidarity trips with the National Union of People's Lawyers, or NUPL, for a couple years now, and really have formed ourselves out of learning the lessons of people's lawyering of NUPL in the Philippines. So just a little bit myself. And if you want to learn more about PL for PL, I think at some point at the end of um, the event, I'll share like the email address and Instagram link so you can follow us for more information. But just a few housekeeping rules. Thank you, V, for sharing it in the chat. Is that while we have speakers, we ask you to please stay muted. There'll be a point at the end of the session to ask questions, so you can unmute and share then. But you're welcome to share questions in the chat ahead of time, but we may not get to it till the Q&A portion. And then also, so we can get to know each other, and for the sake of security, especially given the political situation that we're meeting in the first place, that we ask that you change your name on the Zoom to your name, and then if you have an organization, what organization you're from, so we can know each other. So again, just ask that people stay muted. We'll probably force mute people if you're having technical difficulties, and then we'll have time at the end for a Q&A. So if anyone have any other questions about housekeeping, just let us know. Um, Otherwise, before I welcome the first speaker, just want to say that I'm sure that there's been a lot of panels, a lot of events, a lot of info sessions people have been attending to learn about what happened in the Toboso Negros with the Negros 19 and ways that we can seek justice, but fight for the victims in the Philippines, but overseas also. So today we'll really be walking through, what happened, but also like what was learned since April. What are the different international humanitarian law violations that have been uncovered since then, and the ways that we see that the United States, the U.S. imperialism, has played a direct role in this massacre. And then, of course, the ways as us, as members of the progressive movement, and the international community can fight back, fight for justice, and stand in solidarity with Philippine liberation. So I will pass it to the first speaker, Edre, of the International Association of Democratic Lawyers. Maybe you can give a little uh, intro on what IADL is, to really speak, to open the space about what we're about to learn about Negros and the legal perspective. Thank you.
Okay, am I on? Okay. Thank you and good evening, Amanda. Thank you to friends, comrades, and colleagues. Well, to start with, any discussion or conversation about armed conflicts would be necessarily involved or touch on the question of one, the right or the legality or the justness of the resort of force or armed force, which lawyers call as the use ad bellum on the one hand, and the conduct of the war itself, the behavior of the parties, which we call the use in bello on the other hand. So this would consequently involve the question on the one hand again, the right to resist, and vis-a-vis international humanitarian law or the law of armed conflict. The former, the right to resist, which is inherent anyway, regardless of whether it is contained in any document, but nonetheless is recognized in many international conventions and protocols and instruments, especially in situations where peoples are fighting for the right to self-determination against colonial domination, alien occupation, and against racist regimes, and similar other situations, no? Like grievous human rights violations, no? Or grievous political repression on the one hand. And the latter, which is the law of armed conflict or international humanitarian law, uh, involves standards, principles, and parameters not only with respect to the combatants or even those who have ceased to be combatants, like what we call the hors de combat, those who are sick, wounded, or have surrendered or had no capacity anymore to perform any hostile act. But also, and most importantly, the protection, primarily in fact, the protection of civilians and civilian population, those who do not take direct part in the armed hostilities. So these are the two um, main concepts that should be touched upon in any discussion that like what we're having now. But all this will be very academic, no? Unless you put it in a concrete situation. In the concrete situation, for instance, of the Philippines, no? The context, why there is an ongoing liberation struggle for more than half a century, and what is the role of counterinsurgency programs of the United States in cahoots with the many administrations and even the present one. In other words, the basic question really is, why are people resisting? Why are people resorting to armed force? What are the roots of the armed conflict? What are the reasons why people take up arms and are obliged or compelled as a matter of choice to resort to armed force? But more importantly, perhaps, and significant is what political action can we do in the face of all this, no? In the face of what happened in Toboso and many others. Toboso is just one of the latest. There's been a series historically of violations of the laws of armed conflict. And because this is sponsored and organized, by the way, and I'd like to have shout out to the National Lawyers Guild. And pleasantly, I'm pleasantly surprised that there is a new group of Philippine lawyers. We'd like to know them better along the way. And of course, the IADL. And IADL, as many of you know, has been founded 80 years ago. It's our 80th year anniversary this year. The founders have been actively involved in advocacy for humanitarian law, involved in the Nuremberg trials, as well as in many other initiatives that would pursue the right of peoples to liberation and self-determination. And so, in closing, in my short introduction, because I would like not want like to preempt the many good speakers that are going to talk about the respective topics, IADL has made a very firm position, not only in other countries but especially in the Philippines. But in this particular case, in the Toboso massacre involving 19 individuals, the IADL has called for and will support an international investigation on top of what has already been initiated earlier, um, to look into the possible liabilities of the armed forces of the Philippines and the Marcos administration for that matter. And secondly, IADL has committed and is open to filing legal cases wherever and whenever, particularly with respect to the um, exercise of what we call the universal jurisdiction, where in many states, individuals can be tried for crimes against humanity and war crimes. And finally, IADL is urging, in fact, demanding that the Philippine government of Marcos Jr. administration should adhere strictly to the basic concepts of distinction between civilians and combatants, the principle of precaution, the principle of legality, and the principle of proportion, which I understand my colleagues will touch on later on. So that is what I can provide for now as a segue, as a context to the topic that will be before us. Thank you very much. Salamat po.
Thank you very much for really setting the tone and grounding us in our discussion today. I'm going to pass it to Matty Miquel, who the chairperson of the National Network of Agrarian Reform Advocates Youth, also a spokesperson of the Defend Negros formation, to talk about the political situation overall in Negros and historically, and specifically within the context of the Negros 19. And I think the massacre really highlighted the many different struggles that our people choose to take up, not just in Negros, but in the Philippines, as about 10 of the 19 were Red Fighters of the New People's Army. And the nine rest were farmers and advocates for farmers, and even Filipino Americans who've chosen to go back home to support the peasant struggle. So thank you, Maddie, for speaking on this today.
Hello, good evening. Can you hear me properly?
Yes.
Okay, let me share my screen. So, um, I think Attorney Edre was also able to pose very relevant questions to this discussion. So let allow me to contextualize our discussion to what happened on April 19 and to tie it up to the general situation in Negros Island, given that it's a hotbed for agrarian disputes and state violence overall. So what happened in Negros, in Toboso, Negros, in April 19? So allegedly, there was an encounter between AFP and NPA and the NPA, or the New People's Army. Um, the primary people who were involved were the 79th Infantry Battalion, stationed there in Negros, and there were, as told a while ago, there are 19 casualties, and um, it was already stated by the Communist Party of the Philippines that there were only 10 Red Fighters and 9 civilians who were part of the casualties. Um, so and the other details is just that it happened in early morning in April 19. in Barangay Salamanca, Toboso, Negros Occidental, and it happened in different sites. Um, so what else did we find out initially? So the day after, it was confirmed by the Philippine Army spokesperson, um, and they claimed that all 19 members were part of the NPA and that they were all armed combatants, which is contrary to what the human rights advocates in Negros um, raised um, in the following days. Because in from the numbers itself, um, it's already casting doubt because because 19 in one operation is already so big. So, of course, eventually we saw that there were in fact civilian casualties, and I believe that the next speakers will be able to touch more on the violations involved with that. So, after that, we saw the clamor on social media. Um, Victims were targeted. Um, uh, Maybe we're all sick of the term corned beef by this time, but it's what particularly has been used against victims of encounters between the military and in areas that are spots for armed conflict. And then on April 23, NPA Negros itself denied the military's assertion that all 19 were armed fighters. Essentially, they already claimed and denied the military's claims of that all the ones who were killed during April 19 were armed combatants. So what else should we highlight from this? So eventually, the CPP spokesperson already released the names of the Red Fighters, and then they also released the civilian casualties. So among them are the farmer Roel Sabilio, the journalist RJ Ledesma, the student leader Eliza Alano, and the two peasant advocates and community researchers, Errol Wendell, and our member in Santuyo, and the two Filipino Americans, Lyle Prijoles and Kai Sorem. And there were two minors also involved, but they were left unnamed. So, when the victims of this encounter, of this massacre, uh, went to Negros to claim their loved ones, uh, they were immediately faced by harassment from state forces. They were surveilled. They were attempts. There were attempts to essentially interrogate the family members, and they were in constant threat of um, being photographed, followed around. And I believe Yan Yan would be able to tell more about this later on. So, what should we highlight from this event? Well, essentially, we saw that, and we already know this, that the Philippine military uh, has, for so long, um, is known for their, well, crimes against humanity, for their practice of indiscriminate firing in rural communities, um, especially with these armed encounters. They don't practice providing quarters or um, providing first aid to those who are no longer capable of um, fighting against them, or essentially no quarters given. And that's why, following the events, um, the calls of the people were essentially to have an independent investigation. And as said by Attorney Edre, is to have an international investigation into these killings, given that it's also related to the international humanitarian law. Uh, there are a lot of questionable claims from the military side. From the numbers of the guns itself, it was continually changed throughout the investigation. Initially, they only found nine, and then it became um, 24, just to match the number of the people who were caught and killed. It was it was just basically just shows that they were trying to reach the numbers that were already coming up. So essentially, there's a lot of questions continually popping up from the narrative of the Philippine military. So with all of this, um, what Attorney Edre has said, this is not an isolated case, and it has been part. It's already part of the long history of Negros's long history of agrarian struggles, um, and essentially the conflict rooted in these feudal relations maintained in the island. So, throughout history, uh, massacres have been occurring in Negros. That's why it's already. I don't want to use it because it sounds like it's romanticizing the term, but Negros is aptly called the massacre capital of the Philippines. And Toboso 19, under the Marcos Jr. administration, is the fourth massacre in Negros and sixth nationwide. And it's just Marcos's third year into this in his administration. All over the country, there are more killings, there are more attacks being carried out by state forces. And why? Because it's state enforced. So we have Memorandum Order number 32, which is essentially just saying that the Negros Island is under the state of lawless violence and acts of terror, and state forces can use all means to address this state of lawless violence. And it was applied during the time of Duterte and carried over to Marcos Jr. And on top of that, it's on top of another um, law or policy enforced by the Duterte administration, which is SEMPO. Its meaning is synchronized enhanced managing police operations, or the one-time big-time operations carried out by police and other state forces to address criminal activities in the area. So it's actually related to the extrajudicial killings, the war on drugs carried out during the time of Duterte. Um, so what example of Negros massacre can we see from the Duterte time? And it's one of these is Sagay 9. So in October 2018, nine uh, sugarcane workers were killed in their area of what do you call this? Bungkalan. This is a land occupation movement done to claim their land, um, a meta legal way of reclaiming their land from landlords. And from this time, after they did their bungkalan, while they were resting, they were gunned down by um, unknown forces. But essentially, we can see that this is related to the state enforced killings during this time, because this is the peak of Duterte's attacks on activists, on um, land rights advocates, and farmers in general. And then, because they did not they did not cancel out these policies like MO32, it was carried over to BBM, or to Marcos Jr.'s administration, and we heard of the Fausto family massacre, wherein five members or four members of the family were killed. Two were just children, minors. They were accused of being members of the NPA, and it was the same for the Sagay Nine. So we see that throughout history, they use this narrative to kill our farmers just because they are fighting for their right to till, right to land, which is essentially their livelihood. So let's see what is the long-standing land problem in Negros, because we can see that this is all rooted in the feudal and semi-feudal exploitation experienced by our farmers there. So there's an intense contradiction between Panginong May Lupa, or the landlords, and the farmers. So 3 million hectares of land, there are 3 millions of hectares of land, and 63% of this is privately owned. 80% of the land that is more than 10 hectares are owned by 24% of the landlords in this area. So essentially, we can see that um, there's already a majority in the majority holdings are placed to on the 1% of society, because they are being controlled or monopolized by these landlords. Farmers and sugarcane workers are left to till very little and barely enough to make up for their needs, um, and to make up for their means of survival. Because here, of course, everywhere else, we believe that land is life. They would not be able to survive if they do not own their land. So, what else is there in the long-standing problem in agrarian reforms? So we can see that um, vast hectares of land are controlled and monopolized by landlords, through direct ownership or through inheritance or through lease arrangements. So essentially, um, they also produce more exploitation through land rent. 70% of these of the 160,000 hectares of land distributed through the agrarian reform, the false or the fake and empty land reform, um, which is the comprehensive agrarian reform program, um, were supposedly distributed to 145,000 farmer beneficiaries, but because they are no longer able to make this productive because of high prices of inputs, because of land rent, um, because of the lack of support from the government to for them to be able to till their lands. Uh, they've all been leased out. So essentially, they gave up their right to their land because um, they no longer have the means to sustain it, because they're not being supported by the government. They are essentially being marginalized, and they are essentially being sidelined despite being the backbone of the economy. And then we have the primary or one of the or actually the biggest landlord in the Negros Island, the Cuanco family, and they own 5,035 hectares of land. So um, this family in particular, they own the vast tracts of plantations in this area, in this island. Um, and the Negros Island is already full of plantations. In these plantations, the sugarcane workers here, they receive barely the minimum wage ordered in that particular in that island. Um, it ranges from at least 200 to 300 per day, and it's barely enough to feed a family of five. Um, what more if under the circumstances of here, as we can see, that these workers are primarily under the or being given their wages under the system of pakyawan. So, in a day of like in a let's say in 1 hectare of land, they are provided a certain amount of money, and they have to finish their work there, uh, and then that amount is split among those workers who work the land. So let's say if there's more than 20 of them and they have to split up 7,000 pesos, they wouldn't be able to take home um, they wouldn't be able to take home more than 500 pesos. Um, and in itself, it's already it's already inhumane because as stated here, the daily wage in Negros Island is around 480 pesos, but it's not actually what they receive, essentially because of this system. So other than that, other than the very slave like wages, there's also slave like working conditions. Um, these plantation workers, they don't receive any benefits or it's insufficient, and of course um, because they maintain this kind of system wherein um, they're not able to take home more than or they're not able to take home a livable wage. And then these sugarcane workers, um, they also experience the tiempo muerto or the dead season, wherein there's no work available because it's the time after um, harvesting the sugar canes. So they don't work for like 6 months or more than, especially now that it's the Philippines is currently under the state of super El Nino. So there's longer time of there's a longer time where they won't be able to work, and in this 6 months or more, they're not able to receive support from the government. They're not able to receive support from the owners of the lands that they're working. Um, Essentially, they are left to find work somewhere else, whether it be informal um, or basically they're not secure for these 6 months. So, because of that, we can see that these conditions foster the people to carry on um, their own struggles to to um, to organize themselves and to assert their right to land. So we can see throughout the Negros Island, there are many local mass struggles, but in particular, one of the most famous ones in recent years is the one in Hacienda Asia Plantation Incorporated, or the Happy Plantation. Last year, there were Negros farmers, or there were um, people from Negros Island who went here in the in Manila to have kampuhan, because they were also affected by this project, um, wherein 6,000 hectares are aimed to be converted into a palm oil plantation, and 6,000 hectares um, is such a big number, because 1 hectare is already difficult to imagine if you haven't seen it. So what more if 6,000 hectares? Um, so they plan to expand the palm oil industry for rural development, but essentially, they won't be able to get this big of a land area if they won't grab it from farmers, from indigenous peoples, and if they won't destroy ecologically sensitive areas. So there are a lot of violations already carried out. There are systemic violations of environmental laws, land rights, and labor standards. Um, so that's why when they came here during Kampuhan, or during the camp out, they also went to DNR, or the Department of Environment and Natural Resources, to file a complaint, because essentially the project is destroying the environment in the area. It's causing more flooding, especially now that it's flood control projects is a very big issue in the Philippines. So essentially, land grabbing is not just a problem of livelihood or security, but it's also an environmental problem. And then we also have Micaela. Um, the project is carried out by Taala Farms Development. But the land that they are trying to convert is already covered by the Comprehensive Agrarian Reform Program since 2006. But since they're aiming to use this land and to convert it into a um, private establishment, um, they 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 let out goons, private personnel to threaten the farmers um, who are already tilling the land for a very very long time. So the farmers there, they were harassed by these private goons, and then they already installed structures, and there were also a case where one of the farmers, they were fighting back, and then the goons, they threatened to shoot this farmer. So essentially, we can see that because of the land problem, because of the violence carried out by the state, it is no question why so many of uh, so many of our youth advocates, of student leaders, or journalists, they choose to come to Negros because they know that these statistics, they won't be able to be show they won't be shown by government agencies. They won't be shown by mainstream media. Um, for so many years, starting from Marcos Sr. or even before that, Negros Island has always been a hotbed of state violence. Hence, it is so crucial for uh, advocates and for people who care about the rights of our farmers to continually integrate, to really find out why why the feudal and semi-feudal exploitation continues to perpetrate these um, attacks against our farmers, against the people of Negros, um, because the truth won't come out if we won't go there ourselves. That's why um, the martyrs, like Maureen, like Errol, um, and even Lyle and Kai, um, they're they came here because they know that Negros Island, the people of Negros, they won't be able to, we won't be able to see the reality, um, if not for the people like us who would um, cross oceans, who would cross seas to really live together with our farmers, to really live together with the people of Negros, and to stand with them in their fight for land, life, justice, and peace. So essentially, we just want to say that we should continue to fight for continue to stand and fight alongside our farmers, our fisher folk, our indigenous peoples, um, and for our international audience, of course, we're your skills, your uh, your livelihood, your energy will be most useful if it is um, carried out together with the Filipino masses. Um, if we um, live alongside them and we really see why the Philippines, despite being rich in resources, the Filipino people continue to be um, faced by the ever present poverty, ever present um, hardship from the three roots of these problems, which is imperialism, feudalism, and bureaucrat capitalism. So, so this is where I'll end my discussion. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Maddie, for not just sharing the situation and what happened, but also, really what are the reasons that the state has viewed the farmers and the advocates in Negros as a threat, and in it being completely grounded in the issue of land, land in Negros and the land in the Philippines. And I want to highlight what you said about how it is the people who go to Negros who are able to learn and share and prop the land struggles there and introduce Sarah Raymundo from Bayan, Philippines, the National Democratic Alliance of the Philippines, fighting for national democracy with a socialist perspective. They recently conducted a fact-finding mission in the area. And as we know, they faced heightened surveillance and targeting of the state as a way to hide the truth of what happened. So thank you, Sarah, for sharing with us today.
Thank you so much, Amanda. That's right. Bayan, I represented Bayan in the 100 strong delegates of the National Fact Finding and Solidarity Mission from May 13 to May 15 in Negros. We went to Toboso. I'll be very happy to share with you, if you have not read it yet, the initial findings. We already have a document that we can share. But for this occasion, I'll be focusing. Well, my task is to talk about the U.S.-backed counterinsurgency here in the Philippines. So before I begin, I would just like to say good evening, good day to everyone joining this webinar for justice for the Toboso 19 and all the communities in Negros and across the Philippines that continue to bear the consequences of militarization and unresolved social conflict. So I want to begin not in abstraction, but in Toboso. In the aftermath of the killing of the Negros 19, familiar words quickly emerge in official accounts. We've heard encounter, armed rebels, recovered firearms. And the language arrived with startling speed, almost faster than grieving or mourning itself. So before families could grieve, narratives coming from the state, from the military, had already hardened. Yet on the ground, testimonies revealed a more complicated reality involving civilians, farmers, organizers, and armed revolutionaries whose lives had long been entangled with the social contradictions of Negros. So the Toboso killings cannot be understood simply as an isolated event or solely through the lens of military operations. To understand what happened in Negros, we must situate it in a longer history, which the comrade before me already did. But this time, I'm speaking of the history of US-backed counterinsurgency in the Philippines. And that history begins in a decisive way in 1898. The Treaty of Paris transferred the Philippines from Spain to the United States for $20 million, despite the fact that the Philippines had already declared independence and the islands were in the midst of anti-colonial revolution. So Philippine sovereignty was not recognized. Rather, the archipelago became the object of imperial transfer. So what followed was, of course, not liberation, but conquest. So under the language of benevolent assimilation, that's McKinley, the United States suppressed the first Philippine Republic and mounted a brutal colonial war. Entire communities were subjected to scorched earth tactics. There was forced relocation, starvation, torture, collective punishment. And villages suspected of supporting anti-colonial resistance were destroyed. Civilian populations became targets in a war that sought not merely to defeat combatants, but to sever revolutionary movements from their social base. So this is one of the central characteristics of counterinsurgency. It's the belief that insurgencies survive through civilian support, and that therefore the distinction between combatant and civilian can be blurred or strategically collapsed. So one of the clearest examples of this can be found in the Balangiga massacre in Samar. This is Eastern Visayas. So much of public memory recalls only the infamous retaliation that followed the Balangiga uprising. But what preceded it deserves equal attention. In 1901, Filipino fighters and local residents, using deception, organization, and intimate knowledge of local conditions, launched an attack against occupying American forces. So the US response became one of the harshest episodes of colonial violence in Philippine history. General Jacob Smith ordered Samar transformed into a howling wilderness. So thousands died from military reprisals, famine, and devastation. The objective was not simply battlefield victory. It was deterrence through terror. So counterinsurgency in the Philippines was forged through this logic: civilian suffering as a means of political control. And this history matters because the institutions formed during American colonialism did not disappear with formal independence. The armed forces of the Philippines emerged under strong US institutional influence. You have figures like Douglas MacArthur, who played major roles in shaping military structures, doctrines, and, practically organization. The colonial state and later the neo-colonial state in the Philippines was deeply informed by military approaches to governance. Military agreements changed names across decades, but continuity remained. The Mutual Defense Treaty, the Visiting Forces Agreement, the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement ensured long-term integration between the Philippines and the United States. But military dependence was never only about external defense. It was also about internal order. So following the Second World War, anti-colonial and peasant resistance in the Philippines re-emerged through the Hook movement. So the United States, through the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, involved a partnership between Edward Lansdale and Ramon Magsaysay, who later on became president of the Philippines. They helped develop modern counterinsurgency strategies in the country, in the Philippines. So the campaign against the Hooks became an important laboratory of US Cold War anti-communism. Military operations were combined with propaganda, intelligence work, psychological warfare, and elite consolidation. So this period established an enduring pattern. Counterinsurgency became not merely a military technique, but a mode of governance. So what we actually have in the Philippines is a counterinsurgency state. Across administrations, from Marcos Sr. to subsequent governments, internal dissent, peasant organizing, revolutionary movements, and even legal democratic activism increasingly became viewed through national security frameworks. So the emergence of the Communist Party of the Philippines, the New People's Army, and the moral resistance movements deepened this dynamic. Yet, to describe this solely as a military problem misses the structural conditions that repeatedly generate conflict. And what are these conditions? Landlessness, um, agrarian inequality, concentrated political power, uneven development, and foreign economic independence. So, nowhere are these contradictions more visible than in Negros. Negros has repeatedly become a site where unresolved agrarian tensions intersect with militarization. The island's long history of land concentration, sugar monocropping, labor precarity, and political violence has produced cycles of conflict and repression. So you have massacres happening in Escalante, in Sagay, in Himamaylan, in Gihulngan, Kabangkalan, and more recently, Toboso. So these incidents differ in context and detail, but together they point toward recurring questions. One question would be, uh, why do conditions repeatedly produce violent confrontations? Why does peasant organizing so frequently become securitized? And why has militarization become a recurring state response to unresolved agrarian problems? And um, and this is a major turning point. A major turning point to this came during the Duterte administration. In 2017, peace negotiations between the government of the Republic of the Philippines and the National Democratic Front of the Philippines were terminated unilaterally. For supporters of peace negotiations, the peace process represented an opportunity. However difficult and contradictory, however fragile and frustrating, but it is to address the roots of armed conflict through political dialogue. Um, and its collapse in 2017 marked a significant shift. In place of negotiations came intensified insurgency, the creation of the National Task Force to end local communist armed conflict, or NTF-LCAC, institutionalized what became known as or reinforced what is known as the whole of nation approach, copied hook, line, and sinker from US counterinsurgency. So supporters um, view this framework as integrating development and security efforts. And those who are critical of it argued, and we are critical of it, that it expanded militarized governance into civilian institutions and intensified political labeling, surveillance, and practically red tagging. So, human rights advocates, journalists, church workers, labor organizations, indigenous communities, lawyers, and activists increasingly reported heightened risks associated with accusations of communist affiliation. So, critics of NTF-LCAC argue that such dynamics narrowed democratic space and reinforced a political climate in which dissent could become securitized. So within this broader environment, incidents such as the Toboso killings emerge in ways they're not isolated tragedies, but symptoms of a wider counterinsurgency framework. To understand contemporary counterinsurgency, however, we must also look beyond domestic politics toward geopolitical developments. Military exercises such as Balikatan and Salaknib, which were just held uh, 2 weeks ago, from April 20 to May 6, are often framed through disaster preparedness, interoperability, humanitarian cooperation, and regional stability. Yet they also involve missile systems, amphibious operations, logistics coordination, intelligence sharing, and military integration tied to wider so-called Indo-Pacific strategy, U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy. So the scale and continuity of these exercises raise questions about the Philippines' strategic positioning. Increasingly, Philippine territory functions not only as national territory, but as part of a broader regional military architecture shaped by tensions in the South China Sea and the Taiwan Strait. And at the same time, military integration is increasingly linked to economic restructuring. So we've been having, or the state has been having discussions surrounding semiconductor hubs, logistics corridors, critical minerals, and industrial partnerships. And they're frequently framed as economic modernization. And these developments are part of a broader geopolitical economic alignment in which the Philippines risks becoming integrated into a strategic supply chain, primarily serving external powers. So this seems to be a transition. There seems to be a transition between the post-war Pax Americana to what has been called Pax Silica, which is a technology oriented order where semiconductors, critical minerals, artificial intelligence, logistics, and so on and so forth become increasingly linked to geopolitical competition. And from this perspective, military infrastructure and economic infrastructure increasingly reinforce one another. So, for example, a port is simultaneously commercial and strategic. A logistic corridor can facilitate both trade and military mobility. So economic development from the perspective of the state and the military planning become increasingly difficult to separate. So this also raises questions about regional institutions. Like ASEAN was just recently held here in the Philippines from May 6 to May 8, and it has long emphasized stability, diplomacy, and regional cooperation. But of course, it was founded for communist containment during the post-war period. So basically, it's a consensus-driven model. Often, it addresses militarization, asymmetrical power relations, or escalating geopolitical rivalry, but it actually is always aligned with U.S. imperialist interests. So while regional integration advances economically, many of the deeper questions surrounding sovereignty, dependency, and military alignment remain unresolved. So more recently, strategic frameworks emerging from the United States, including developments under Donald Trump's renewed administration, they have emphasized expanded national security coordination, counterterrorism, and integrated approaches to political violence. And we must note that this continuities with older counterinsurgency logics. You have broader intelligence coordination, financial monitoring, legal mechanisms, and the expansion of security frameworks into civilian domains. So contemporary counterinsurgency no longer appears only through battlefield operations. It increasingly works through institutions, surveillance systems, legal categories, information campaign, and public narratives. So in this sense, counterinsurgency evolves, but its underlying logic remains recognizable. The central question is still this: how does a state contain forces it conceives as threatening political order? and whose lives become vulnerable in the process. The Toboso 19 massacre compels us to ask these questions urgently, whether civilians, organizers, or armed revolutionaries, those killed in Negros existed within a wider social landscape marked by inequality, unresolved um, land questions, militarization, and competing political visions of justice and transformation. So justice for the Toboso 19, therefore, requires more than accountability for a single incident. It requires sustained public attention to the historical conditions that repeatedly make such violence possible. So from the Treaty of Paris to Balangiga, to Samar, to Cold War counterinsurgency, from anti-hook operations to contemporary militarization, the Philippines has repeatedly confronted the tension between security and democratic inclusion, between sovereignty and dependency, between militarized order and social reform and revolution. So the challenge before us is not only to remember the dead, but how to examine the structures that continue producing conflict in the present. I will end there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you for reminding us that this massacre is not just in a vacuum, but even connected to the other coin and militarization efforts with the Balakatan exercises, with the recent missile that was launched into Luzon, and even the Pax Silica, the role of different multinational corporations and finance capital, and how it all links to the issues on the ground on the fight for land. Next, I'll pass it to Marienne Cuzon, who is the wife of Lyle Prijoles, the one of the two Filipino Americans martyrs of the Negros 19.
Hello, thank you. Again, yeah, my name is Marianne. I'm currently based in San Francisco Bay Area, and I am the wife of Lyle Prijoles, one of the 19, Negros 19, who was massacred on April 19th. Lyle was 40 years old when he was killed. He will be 41 on May 30th, but his life was taken and shortened by the 79th IB. When the news first broke, similar to what the previous speakers have said, the narrative was controlled by the military about the incidents, the labeling of the 19 who were massacred as combatants, as terrorists. They even released images of the lifeless bodies and claimed the victory and the elimination of the New People's Army in North Negros. The military blocked off the crime scene and did not properly document any of the items that were found. At the point of us retrieving the bodies, we were asking for all of their belongings, and the police in the area couldn't tell us much of where their belongings were. And they were even brought to the funeral homes without any clothes. And that's also how mistakenly Errol's body was switched. The military did what they could to cover it up, but they can't erase that they killed 19 people. And 6 of those were confirmed to be civilians through the fact-finding mission. But I already knew that. The process to get his remains, we were informed and told that he was part of the 19 that were killed. And they originally gave us only 24 hours to travel from the US all the way to the Philippines to claim his body, or else that the military was going to place them in a mass grave. So luckily our advocates on the ground pushed for an extension to that 24 hours, and we were able to retrieve his remains and bring him back to San Diego. It's only right to talk about who Lyle was. He was a loving and dedicated Filipino activist. He was my husband. In his youth, he joined different organizations, and that's how he was brought to the Philippines. He went to the Philippines on his first immersion in 2006, where he saw firsthand the issues of the communities on the ground, and that's where he fell in love with the community, and that's why he wanted to go back. So this is not his first time. It's actually normal for people here in the US, especially Filipino Americans who were born here, to want to know what the issues are in our homeland. And so he understood the need to go back to Negros to integrate in Toboso. He loved learning about the Filipino people. He loved sharing the lessons that he would gather from the organizers on the ground to how we could organize here and extend more and more the organizing of the Filipino masses here. The armed forces of the Philippines does not care about who are these people that they killed. They only view them as a body count. And they only want to claim that they have neutralized the New People's Army in Negros. That's the only thing that they were promoting as we were getting the news of who was killed. But they should know that the Negros 19 that they killed has a story and that they're human beings. And soon after the news broke, just like what others have said, the trolls went to work and reposted their images of the lifeless bodies, calling them corned beef, but they're humans. And so the fight ahead for the justice for the Negros 19 and the justice for Lyle will be a long one. The military is backed by a government that doesn't care about the people. And the very issues that Lyle went to go learn about in the community of Toboso, the issues are still there and they're still present. The repression on the community is still present. And it will not be enough just to fight for the Negros 19, but also to learn more about the issues of all the people in the Philippines, especially the peasants in the countryside. And so we must expose from where we are what's happening in the Philippines. And so I will fight for justice for Lyle, not only because he's my husband, but I know that fighting for justice for Lyle means to also fight for justice for the peasant masses of Negros. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kasama, for showing up and being brave and continuing the fight for and with Lyle. And then I'm going to introduce now our next speaker, Neri Colmenares. He is a human rights lawyer from NUPL, a three-term congressman for Bayan-Muna, but also himself from Negros. He will share with us the legal avenues for justice based off the international humanitarian law. And I think it's important for us as lawyers, but as advocates, to even know that by the state standard, by the bourgeois standards of the international community, that what has happened are crimes against humanity. It's not just a moral, political violation, but even a bourgeois legal violation. So thank you, Attorney Neri.
Thank you. Thank you to the IADL, the NLG, and other IADL members, foreign friends, and kababayans abroad for your continuing concern to the plight of the Filipino people. I have slides, so I hope you can show it now because yeah, I was thank you for that. I was given the topic of the issue of possible IHL violations with respect to what happened in Negros. So I'll probably delve into that immediately because I was just given 10 minutes. So uh, let's go straight to it now. So uh, and before I start, I just like to say our sympathies, to express our sympathies to the families of the victims, yung asawa ni Lyle and the others, for that atrocity that happened in Negros. Next slide, please. Well, the initial next slide. The Negros Massacre started with a report from the military that 19 people were killed in Toboso on April 19. And as mentioned by Matty, I think, on April 20, they already crowd that the military was able to kill 19 NPAs and 24 firearms were confiscated. Um, but later, facts showed that there are many human rights advocates and families and witnesses are saying that it's not really fully true, and that in fact there were civilians there, and that the civilians were later identified. Among them were the ones mentioned a while ago. Some of them are journalists, some of them are student leaders, others are social activists. There was a report, there was a fact-finding mission, and I wasn't yet able to get the copy. Well, I just saw the copy of the report, but based on the statements of the families, the statements from human rights advocates, initial media reports I got from GMA7, some of their pictures showed that, in fact, there were questions as to what happened in the Negros massacre. Some were found to be shot in the back to contradict the military claims that they were fighting actively uh, before they were shot. No? And in fact, there was an initial report I saw that one was shot in the leg and died because of of- I don't know how, but probably he was left to die. Some were found in the water and floundering in the water before they were probably killed. Some were unidentifiable due to mutilation. And there were signs that evidence like guns or bandoliers were planted on the dead. But what is very sure is that no serious investigation or autopsy were conducted by the military. In fact, it was the spokesperson of the Armed Forces of the Philippines, the AFP, was questioned several times if this were really, is there an investigation, a SOCO report, which is scene of the crime, operation of the police, and so on. But the answer was not very, very clear. So, for all these reasons, there is a strong suspicion that violations of international humanitarian law were committed in the Negros massacre. Next slide, please. Among the civilians is RJ Ledesma. He has pictures here. Of course, RJ is known because he is an election. He campaigned during elections. He reports about what transpires during elections. Of course, I see him in some of the press conferences we have on environmental issues, and so on. And that's why I was really surprised why he was killed in that encounter in Toboso, because just a few months ago we were discussing issues on environment, especially the Panay Negros Bridge that's being constructed. Next slide, please. And then this is the shocking part, because this is what's left of RJ after that. And there were reports that even that he was not armed, and that he was just shot as a civilian, and that the so-called bandolier was just placed on top of him. If you look at the two pictures, you can immediately see signs of problems here. Meaning to say, the bandolier was not even attached to his body. So RJ was one of the civilian casualties there. Next slide, please. Of course, Alisa, student leader, she's incumbent counselor of the state university. And we, for the military to allege that she's no longer functioning as a student counselor or a student council, but an NPA, is really is really unbelievable and unacceptable. And she goes to the peasants, to the farmers, But is that already a combatant? Does that transform you a combatant? I was it's mentioned a while ago by that I was born in Negros, and when we were very young, we were members of the Student Catholic Action, which is a Catholic church organization. We're not really activists then, but part of the teachings of the church then was for us to immerse with the farmers. So when I hear these reports, these kinds of reports, I was thinking, what if during our time, which was during martial law, what if we were in the wrong place? Then we would have been the casualties too because we were there with the farmers, and the military would just say, "Oh, why were you there in the first place? So you're an NPA because you were there." Trying to be a part or trying to find out the conditions of our peasants. Next slide, please. So the questions remain. And one thing that caught my attention was on April 28th, nearly 10 days after the incident, the military spokesperson was interviewed on TV by a well known media personality in the Philippines. And I was really shocked by her answers. She was asked by the media host, what was the relationship of the civilians killed with the NPA? And she said, we're still establishing it. On April 20, the Armed Forces spokesperson said they were all NPAs. They were all armed. And now she was asked pointedly, she said, we are still establishing it. That's a fatal admission for me. So you don't know really that whether these civilians are part of the NPA or not, but you already announced it to the world. And then the next question was the media person was very persistent. So there is still no clear relations between the students and the local journalists with the NPA. We are still collating evidence. And this really heightened my surprise because they were really admitting here that they were not sure. And then she was asked, were all those killed all carrying firearms? And she said, all this will be disclosed by the proper authorities. And the persistent media interviewer said, no, no. So you cannot confirm that the journalists and the UP students were carrying firearms? Yes, sir. We are just confirming that 19 were killed and 24 firearms were found. But this is precisely what she said on April 20. One day after the encounter, she just went back and said the same thing, but she admitted during that interview that they weren't really sure if they were NPAs or that they were individually armed. So all these are telltale signs of possible violations of IHL. Next slide, please. So let's just go to the just
Well,
a
Richard thought they were. I didn't like the taste. So
hello, hello.
It's okay. I am muted. You can continue.
Oh, okay. So just a basic framework because we know that IHL is the legal framework applicable to situation of armed conflicts, practically regulating four types of entities. First, the belligerent nations, the neutral nations, and the individuals engaged in warfare, meaning like military people, in relation to protected persons. Protected persons are sick and wounded soldiers, shipwrecked sailors, prisoners of war, and civilians. Why did I have to stress this? Because if you're a civilian, you're a non-combatant, for example, IHL prohibits immediately any attack on you. But just to clarify, even if you're not a civilian, under IHL, even if you're a combatant, the moment the moment that you're already sick or wounded or imprisoned or detained, you're no longer a combatant and you are protected by IHL. So that's the premise I'd like to set. Next slide, please. So, what are the possible violations? Well, there are many. Can cite the Geneva Conventions, the additional protocols, Protocol 2 in particular, Article 8 of the Rome Statute, and Protocol 2, Sections 4, 5, and 6 and 7. In any case, just to sum it up, It says that in cases of armed conflict not of an international character, serious violations of Article 3 common to the four Geneva Conventions of 1949, namely any of the following acts committed against person taking no active part in the hostilities or placed as hors de combat by sickness, wounds, detention, or any other cause. Notice any other cause similar to that that practically makes you no longer a combatant or has no capacity for offense or even defense. Then you are protected. And it says the various acts: violence to life and person, murder, mutilation, if mutilation was committed, committing outrages against personal dignity, declaring that no quarters will be given. And I would suspect that this order was actually given in Toboso. No quarters will be given. That's why if there are this so many people, will just kill so many people, ask questions later, shoot first. Next slide, please. Course, there is also the local law here. Even the local law here would cite IHL. The Philippines, the laws here, unfortunately, are like promises of the government are made to be broken. The justice system is inhospitable to human rights prosecution, but even their laws, they have to admit that there are certain acts called war crimes. And next slide, please. And one of the possible liability here, if even using our local law and of course the international law, because it patterned itself to international law in cases of non-international armed conflict, serious violations of Article 3, the same statement under the Protocol 2, violence to life and person, willful killings, other serious violations of the laws and customs applicable to armed conflict, and essentially attacking, killing those who no longer have the means of defense. That basically shows that. So you can immediately trace several possible violations here. Next slide, please. Next slide. Oh, well, that's just the site of the killing. So, next slide. I'll just go to the last slide now because I'm running out of time. So probably we'll end with a, a we urge you and all those who are concerned with human rights to help us do something about this. Of course, raising awareness on Philippine human rights conditions is an important thing. Conducting forums and other awareness raising a fora to discuss the human rights conditions in the country is very important. Organizing human rights networks to advocate for human rights and social reforms in the Philippines, very important too. And of course, support human rights lawyers and human rights defenders, very crucial in making sure that at least there are people who continue to help defend and protect the rights of the Filipino people. Of course, helping in filing complaints in international bodies because it's not easy for us to have access to these international bodies. Whether it's the filing of a complaint or drafting or researching, very important help here. Not only in international bodies, but even, I don't know, maybe we could try in your particular country if you have universal jurisdiction laws there, such as Germany or Spain or Switzerland or Canada or Belgium and many others. Although I'm very familiar that there is a narrowing of universal jurisdiction interpretation in various countries, it is still worth a try, not just in the Toboso case, but in many other cases and massacres in the Philippines. We hope you would also urge your particular governments in various countries to scrutinize Philippine human rights conditions, especially if there is an issue of trade between your country and ours, or security relations like the status of visiting forces agreements, or military aid for that matter. I'm sure the taxpayers in various countries around the world would not want to spend one taxpayer dollar to buy a bullet to kill Filipinos. I'm very sure of that. And that maybe you can also help scrutinize You urge your government at least not to be blind to the atrocities of our Philippine government. And of course, lastly, to demand accountability for human rights atrocities in the Philippines and demand justice for the Toboso massacre. Thank you very much. Good day.
Thank you very much, Attorney Neri. Folks, please feel free to share more questions in the chat. We'll address in the Q&A, pull it aside. Um, but yeah, the framework of international humanitarian law really hammers home that one, that the armed revolution in the Philippines is a legitimate armed conflict and is just and warrants upholding human rights and humanitarian law, that the CPP and PA are not just rebels or insurgents, but actually legitimate combatants, and that war must be conducted in this framework that we've seen in the Negros 19 situation, but as a whole has been violated over and over again. So. I'll end with our last speaker, Suzanne Adely, from the National Lawyers Guild, who will help really link us this very localized massacre to the national struggle of the Philippines, to the international, the global sphere that we're all coming in from. Thank
Thank you, Amanda. My internet might be a little bit unstable, so just let me know and I can turn off my camera. Um, so in 2024, there was an international tribunal held regarding the role of the US in the counterinsurgency campaign in the Philippines, in the impact it's had for the Filipino people. The tribunal showed clearly how the conflict in the Philippines cannot be understood simply as an internal matter. Testimony from both experts and folks on the ground showed that the US has played a central role in shaping and supporting the Philippine government's counterinsurgency operations, and they continue to play a central role. The struggle in the Philippines represent anti-imperialization and militarization, and the struggle is seen by the U.S. government as a threat to its geopolitical um, and global and economic interests. I mean, their geopolitical and economic interests in the Asia-Pacific region and globally. And I'm going to share some slides. One second. That I'm going to use to just sort of summarize some of the information that came out of that tribunal, which I think still applies to the current situation. One second. Okay. Let me just, here we go. So yeah, th this tribunal, which took place 2 years ago, looked at, as I said, the role of the United States in the counterinsurgency in the Philippines. And much of the export testimony, as I said, showed that the US was playing a central role. And I'm going to talk a little bit more in detail about that, what that means. And a lot of the discussion also talked about, what were the U.S. interests that has kept them there since, going back to, what Sarah mentioned, the time that Sarah had mentioned in terms of when the U.S. first started to, occupy or take control over the Philippines. Let me see. I can't really. There we go. I'm just going to do it like this. Sorry. So we talked
a great deal about what the U.S. strategic interests are in the Philippines and have been historically. We know that the U.S. has opposed the peace negotiations, and they have continued to encourage a militarized approach to what they say is ending the armed conflict. They have characterized the Philippines as strategically important for what they say is countering China. And well, the United States itself, if you were to ask them directly, why they continue sort of to have a military interest in the Philippines, they would probably give sort of a similar excuse that they give for other military interventions, which is as a war on terror, part of the war on terror, particularly against what they would say Islamist influences or leftist influences. Um, but I think that there is a clear consensus that they're working to sort of maintain their influence in the region, but their influence in the region impacts their influence around the world, right? Their ability to counter China, their ability to have access to, as Sarah was saying, was this strategic supply chain, um, and their ability also to protect the interests of the multinational corporations that continue to function there, that the people struggle are struggling against. Um, so it's a multi sort of level interest for the United States, and it's particularly important because when we talk about like why the U.S. has gotten also, so involved in the genocide in Gaza or in the war in Iran, it's similar sort of there's specific strategic interests in the region, but these regional interests also impact the US's global domination, right? And particularly in the face of a growing multipolar world. So a little bit about the scale of U.S. support. The Philippines have became the largest recipient of U.S. military aid in the Asia Pacific region. And since 2005, as reported in the tribunal, they have received about 1.14 billion in military equipment and training, more than 1 billion in weapon sales, and about 128 million allocated for U.S. military facilities. Now, under the Trump administration, they have also, I think this is additional from what I've seen, a further 2.5 billion to sort of be allocated annually between 2026 and 30. And the Trump administration has also been very much in support and offering economic support for the growth of the Luzon Economic Corridor, which is not just the United States, but also some other Western powers and the Philippine government and regional powers as well, which is been designated for private investment, which is interested in things like AI production and minerals. As Sarah was mentioning, it's part of the strategic supply chain. So it's sort of, economic as well as sort of military interests. Um, but just to reiterate that the there is a flow of money that goes in supporting military equipment and training and capacity building on the ground, uh, which I which I think is a continues to flow through these bilateral agreements that the U.S. has with the United States, and particularly security agreements. And the Trump administration under the National Defense Authorization Act is allocating additional money to support also the security and defense of the Philippines. And I'm not sure how much the United States is allocating economically to the growth of the Luzon Economic Corridor, but I think it'd be very important to sort of keep an eye on that. Thousands of American troops have been deployed to the Philippines, and U.S. personnel, participate in military training and advisory operations, like the Balakatan in April 2024, which involved thousands of U.S. and Filipino troops. Um, and and I think, we should sort of be asking the question also of like, where are the American troops in the context of the massacre that we've just seen? Um, The Philippine counterinsurgency strategy itself was modeled on U.S. doctrine of counterinsurgency. And the strategy emphasizes militarization combined with civil relations programs. And U.S. military training has helped to shape Filipino counterinsurgency tactics, counterterrorism operations, and what they call the whole of nation approach. The tribunal looked at all of these sort of aspects of U.S. involvement, from funding to training, to troops on the ground, to the capacity building, to the modeling of Filipino counterinsurgency after U.S. counterinsurgency. And it looked at it historically as well as in recent years. Um, and the evidence presented as a whole that the U.S. government directed, trained, and armed Philippine state forces, provided diplomatic support and international critique, played an indispensable role in enabling counterinsurgency, and played an indispensable and central role in enabling counterinsurgency operations. And witnesses argued that the support was essential to the implementation of Filipino military campaigns linked to human rights violations. Um, Again, I think that the U.S. were very often sort of referred to the Philippines as a major ally, a non-NATO ally, an ally in the region, as a partner in the war on terror. Um, and again, their interest in the region is very much linked to their global interest of dominance. And these are the security agreements that the United States has with the Philippines, including the Mutual Defense Treaty, the Visiting Forces Agreement, the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, Mutual Logistics Support Agreement. And there is security and military exchange that is connected with all of these. And these agreements have helped to facilitate increased troop deployments, expanding military bases, and pre-positioning of military equipment in the Philippines. And the consequences of these joint counterinsurgency operations, as documented by witnesses, have been heavy bombardments of civilian communities, forced displacement of civilians, attacks on civilian populations, suppression of humanitarian aid, terror tactics against civilians, which others have talked about, which have all constituted alleged violations of international humanitarian law, like the ones that Neri have mentioned: willful killing of civilians, attacks on civilian objects, indiscriminate warfare, forced displacement, torture and inhumane treatment, enforced disappearances, arbitrary detention, harassment, red tagging, and terrorist labeling, and extrajudicial assassinations. So this tribunal looked at the U.S.'s central role to the very sort of levels that I just sped through, and concluded that the Biden administration was itself guilty of violating international humanitarian law in the Philippines, through their support of the Filipino counterinsurgency on all of these levels. And I think that we can say with certainty that all of the U.S. administrations that have been part of facilitating this relationship and causing this sort of like immense violence that we've seen in the Philippines through the militarized counterinsurgency program are also guilty of these violations. And I think that we can probably conclude, but it'd be good to sort of gather to look more closely at where the U.S. is on the ground right now in Negros, and in terms of training the perpetrators of that massacre, to see where we can turn sort of our focus towards the Trump administration to call them out and call for accountability for their role in the massacre as well. Um, so that was a quick summary of the tribunal 2 years ago, whose findings and evidence I think can really inform what's happened, what happened on April 19th. But I just want to shift gears for a second to say that First, I want to just give condolences to Marienne and all the family members who have lost loved ones in this massacre. Listening to you is just conjuring up a lot of, the loss that we have felt in the Arab world, in Palestine, in Gaza, in Palestine, in Lebanon, in Iran, for these past few years. And I think that one thing that I really want to emphasize, other than just, our pure solidarity as a movement, as a Arab diaspora movement in the US, as an anti-imperialist movement in the US, is that, when we look at the people who were targeted and killed and the work that they were doing, the vital, important work that they were doing, right, reminds us that the people's struggle itself in the Philippines is such a valuable and important one. When we talk about Gaza and when we talk about Iran, we often talk about how they themselves and the resistance in the West Asia, we talk about how they are very much kind of on the forefront of anti-imperialist resistance, of resistance of the global majority against US imperialism and domination. I think that's also very true of the Philippines themselves. And I think the Philippines um, struggle has been a front against imperialism and but also the structural violence of multinational corporations for many years. And I think in the US and we need to work to sort of have, and there are opportunities to integrate more of the anti-imperialist struggle that we have building in support of um, the resistance in West Asia. I think that there are opportunities to connect more also to the support that we need to continue to be building for the people struggle in the Philippines. Starting with calls for accountability for US imperialist violence. Now, at a time like this, obviously, the Trump administration has been extraordinarily unhinged when it comes to imperialist violence. But I think we need to remind ourselves at the importance of continuing to um, teach the U.S. movement about the importance of the Filipino struggle and the importance of advocating for justice for the victims of the Negros Massacre, as well as all the victims at the hands of the U.S. Filipino counterinsurgency. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Really breaking down the guilt that the U.S. Empire has in these war crimes and in these massacres. So we're going to segue into our Q&A session. Been collecting some of the questions. They're in the chat. And I think actually what Suzanne presented to us is a good segue to the first set of questions. I'll drop them in the chat. And I think Attorney Neri, you were also some of it is directed towards you, but for everyone. And however, first I'm gonna kind of get a first first answer these two questions about how the Philippines and even its agencies are promoting itself as being concerned about human rights advocates, about having a working justice system, and I think just like one clearly that they don't uphold human rights at all, as we've seen and know and discussed here. But it's actually really important for us to continue not just exposing that truth, but to reach out to not our allies, but also those beyond like our organized relationships to expose because on June 2nd, the UN will have its vote on if the Philippines will join the Security Council. And I don't think I have to belabor it too much to show that the Philippines is not just a failure at peace and security, but is actually the number one threat to peace and security in the Philippines. So on May 20th at the UN, there will be a debate between the Philippines and Kurdistan to inform this vote. So here in New York, there are efforts to really propagate against the Philippines kind of campaign for the Security Council seat, but really encourage that across the world, everyone to reach out to different permanent missions of countries, different NGO, civil society organizations, to share with them what they are, are learning, from this webinar or just from the political situation, and really advocate for them to vote either against the Philippines in the Security Council seat or for other NGOs for them to also speak out, for them to do silent protests, for them to contact their own sort of connections within the UN to say no against the Security Council seat. And then similarly, the United Nations will actually be holding a counterterrorism week at the end of June at the UN from June 26th to July 2nd. This is, will be a series of conferences and talks about, counterterrorism. And the Philippines, will be present to speak about how they've upheld, humanitarian and human rights law through their coin policies. That is also a prime time to really expose the lies that the Philippines peddles about its governance. And here in New York, we'll be trying to hold our own sort of counter side events to similarly expose how Coin has really targeted legal activists, has caused crimes against humanity. But I've shared in the chat the two questions and want to pass it to Attorney Neri and others to talk about, to answer, and also specifically on the investigation of the Commission of Human Rights.
Oh, are you asking me now, Amanda?
Yes, there
Yes,
is.
okay. Well, I did say something about that. You could ask the ambassador actually immediately to make him uncomfortable. What was the result of the CHR investigation? I'm surely he doesn't know the result because there's been very minimal impact on the part of the CHR with regards human rights violations. There are some officials there that are hospitable to human rights, but there are many officials also who are not. But in any case, whatever the hospitableness of the official of SHR is, the fact is it has no prosecutorial power. It conducts administrative investigations. And the more important question to the ambassador and the Philippine government, who did you prosecute? And they will be put in a quandary to answer that because they can only cite model cases like Ian de los Santos. So when we go to the embassy to ask questions about that the CHR is investigating, be prepared with many cases which were not investigated and prosecuted by the government. So basically, that's my answer to the question about going to the ambassador, and the ambassador says that anyway, the CHR is investigating these human rights violations. Do not accept that and insist on the prosecution of human rights violator. And I'm sure that he will have to admit that the justice system in the Philippines inhospitable to human rights prosecution. Thank you.
Thank you. The next question, open, but particularly Sarah Raymundo, if you have a direct answer, is around other countries besides the US who have similar, EDCA or VFA agreements with the Philippines, and how does that fit in the US Philippines coin framework?
Um, can you hear me? Okay, so I think the increasing defense agreements with countries such as Australia, Japan, Canada, France, etc., should be understood as um, multilateralization of a historically US-led counterinsurgency architecture, US-led imperialism. So, what was once bilateral, what was once a primarily bilateral US-Philippines coin relationship is now embedded in a broader Indo-Pacific alliance system. And while these arrangements are framed around maritime security, humanitarian response or external defense, they strengthen the same military institutions, intelligence systems, um, interoperability, and security logics that also shape internal counterinsurgency. So, in other words, external militarization and internal counterinsurgency, they increasingly reinforce one another. So the same AFP trained for regional security is also the same institution conducting COIN domestically. So on the level of political economy, these arrangements help stabilize the conditions for, as I said earlier, strategic supply chains, logistics corridors, and so on. Um, so security cooperation uh, secures not only territory, but political economic order tied to US aligned accumulation, which is now primarily generated through the accumulation of war. So rather than a purely Philippine security policy, I think this is best understood as the Philippines being integrated into a what we might call a networked US aligned security architecture where geopolitics, um, economic domination, and counterinsurgency converge alongside imperialist allies of the US and its semi-colonies like the Philippines.
Thank you. Does anyone, any other speakers have any answers or any last questions that people have? You can also raise your hand if you have a question or comment. Okay. Okay. Knowing that the Philippines is no longer a state party to the Rome Statute, what other international tribunals or instruments can hold the Philippines accountable for the crimes of the Negros 19?
Well, if you're asking me, uh, in terms of criminal prosecution, of course, only the International Criminal Court. So there are, of course, the UN treaty bodies. You can lodge complaints there, but it's not a criminal prosecution. And the Philippines usually just sorts of ignores this international. It will say something about it, but it doesn't really want to follow the recommendations anyway. But it would be good to file an international body still. But it's not the criminal prosecution we are asking. The other, of course, is, as I mentioned in my talk, maybe we can entertain maybe the universal jurisdiction uh, aspects of your particular laws against not the ordinary military, the top ones, the president or the generals, just like what we did in the ICC when we filed the case of crime against humanity against President Duterte in 2018. Um, yeah, so we will still attempt to go through the treaty bodies. We just vary our expectations. First, it's not going to be a criminal prosecution, but every time we file in international treaty bodies, it makes the Philippines a little defensive, and it is possible that with enough outrage being shown by the international community, it can temper the human rights violations here. It happened during time of Gloria Arroyo, when so much international attention was, being given to extrajudicial killings here. She did temper that, and even Duterte to a certain degree when international outrage was expressed. So these things that you can do through the international bodies, short of a criminal prosecution in the International Criminal Court, of course, is very important. It does save lives. It does save lives because they sometimes temper it depending on the outrage of the international community. Last point, maybe you're thinking that a rally of 10 or 20 or 30 human rights advocates in the Philippine embassy in the US or in Canada or in somewhere in Europe is just a small thing. No, no, it's really a big deal because the moment it gets reported here, the government sorts of reacts to that. So it's very important that you do that. The second impact, of course, is that it sorts of assures the Filipino people that we are not alone in the struggle, that there are other countries, other kababayans, and foreign friends who are concerned about the conditions here. So it sorts of gives us additional courage to face the atrocities of rapacious government like the Marcos US government now. So all these things remain an important part, but criminal prosecution, we are pushing that the government of the Philippines, of course, return to the ICC. And we don't know the result of this, but just the call of various countries around the world for various people's organizations around the world for the Philippines to return to the ICC could help also in the struggle to push for a return to the ICC. We have no illusions, by the way, with the ICC. It's just that it gives us one more venue for criminal prosecution as exemplified by the Duterte case in the ICC today. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. So I think we'll close, but I think that's a point point to end on is really like, yes, there is a lot of legal, international legal frameworks that we can use. We can also use the sort of the lobbying within the UN framework to really expose and to defend our people, but it must always be part of the larger mass movement, the larger mass mobilization, the mass organizing of the Filipino people and our allies across the world. That it is actually because of that like grassroots activism and the groundwork that's being done that there can be any success in any sort of like legal realm or international realm. So I want to thank everyone for spending their evening, their morning, their afternoon with us. I'm going to share in the chat the contact information of our sponsoring organizations. So thank you those from the International Association of Democratic Lawyers, to the National Lawyers Guild, and thank you for inviting People's Lawyers for Philippine Liberation to help moderate and attend. Please follow us on Instagram to learn more. And if you're based in New York, feel free to reach out. But hopefully this won't be the first and only time that we'll gather. Yeah, it's a very difficult time right now for our people. But I want to commend everyone for their courage to keep speaking up and to continue fighting. And lastly, just call for, the justice for the Negros 19. Thank you.